Hey everybody, and thank you for tuning into Blitzkrieg Pop edition number 38, Sounds Irish, Acts Global, which is the title of a book recently published by Equinox and authored by Michael Murphy, who is our guest today. Hi, Michael. Nice to have you
How are you
again
doing?
on the show. Yes, the last time we had you on the show, we were celebrating the publishing of another book of yours, Punks Listen, published by Hope Collective, a collective based in Dublin. This time, Sounds Irish Acts Global is available for order on equinoxpub.com. So the full title of the book is Sounds Irish Acts Global, Explaining the Success of Ireland's Popular Music Industry. And I'm added to your title and its various parameters and paradoxes. It has a strong emphasis on the individuals and the entrepreneurship behind the development of the Irish music industry within the global context. But before we get into more detail, Michael, could you maybe perhaps briefly tell us what made you write this book, but also describe a bit the unorthodox approach you took to writing this book and how you found the DIY approach that we're familiar with the punk movement has always been a direction of choice for the Irish involved in the music industry? Just maybe a global general introduction.
Yeah, the book came out of, I guess, my direct experience with the Dublin punk DIY scene, but also my experience with the global major label music industry. I worked for major labels. I worked for Virgin. I worked for a label called Imago that was set up by the man Terry Ellis, who had founded Chrysalis Records. I then managed bands. I had an act signed to every one of the major labels, so all five as there were then. And then I thought, what haven't I done? I haven't signed a band to Disney. So I did that. And then I thought, okay, I've done it all. I thought I can stop now. So it really was born out of that duality, that those two strands that I've experienced directly, the DIY, the cooperative music scene. And I try and distinguish between the music scene, which is DIY, and then the music industry, which are the major labels and its contracts and its ownership. So I guess my approach was really informed by the fact that I see both of those things and I go looking for them. And I met with my co-author, Jim Rogers, who's a complete expert in how the actual global music industry works. So I thought Jim can cover that brilliantly. And I think that's one of the strongest chapters in the book is the chapter where Jim looks at the current state of the global music industry and how concentrated it is. I think it's more concentrated than people sometimes realize. And that then freed me up to look at the granular. You can see the DIY in punk, but I thought, was there DIY in Enya? And I approached
Yeah.
it out of just blind curiosity. And then I thought, well, there won't be any in Westlife or Boyzone, so I'll be able to say they didn't have any. And then, oh, hang on. Actually, there's very, very significant DIY activity by teenagers, by young people. And we tend to think that there are stylists and choreographers and Svengalis and major label experts who kind of shine up five people and then get them ready for the world stage. But I was amazed and surprised and pleased and felt an urgent need to document the fact that you find that DIY activity even in acts that don't appear to have anything to do with DIY.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a very original idea. And as you mentioned, I heard you say the word, so the name Enya and maybe Boyzone. Today, we're probably not going to talk about the usual punk bands or punk related characters, but we are bearing three things in mind. I think the fact that the Irish spend a lot of money on music. U2 is one of the main, I'd say, economic exports of Ireland. I mean, I hate to talk about people as exports, but in terms of money, you know, that's the truth. One of the largest selling artists in the world. And also the fact that the economic and political circumstances of Ireland have been such that a diaspora has settled in both the States and in the UK. And I think we, you know, unfortunately, as you know, as you know, U2 for a long time have been considered as a British act as well. And, you know, I think the Fontaines DC also have that thing that people think that they come from Britain because, you know, but Ireland is this very specific island stuck between the UK and the USA, and it's always a kind of a battle to assert your sovereignty, so to speak, you know, economically as well as politically. And I think your first chapter was very, very interesting because it showed the progressiveness of the Irish abroad and their sense of enterprise. So I think the first chapter of your book is called Early Stage of the Music Industry. And I think maybe I'd like you to talk to us about a character called Victor Herbert and his contribution to the development of that, you know, Irish music industry abroad.
Victor Herbert is a fascinating character, and he's generally now not included in the Irish music history because his music was of that time. Now it has dated. But at the time where he was popular, Victor Herbert was a superstar. And he was a superstar in America at a time where economically, you know, the US was the most successful country on the planet. And we had this guy who was very, very invested in Ireland, in Irishness, in popular music. And he had a huge, huge media footprint. He was incredibly influential because of his popularity, because of his fame. He was able to talk about things that mattered to him. And one of the things that really mattered to him and that he was very passionate about was Irish independence. And I think people forget or didn't know in the first place that the two biggest ethnic groups in the US in the 1910s were the Irish and the Germans. So you can imagine the tension when World War I arrives on the global stage. And, you know, Britain is obviously saying to the US, you've got to come in. Like, this is our battle. But there are two very, very significant ethnic groups in the US who are thinking, you've got, if you do go in, well, maybe it's not so clear what side you would go. So Victor Herbert, again, he was of his time. So he certainly publicly stated that he thought, you know, this is, you know, World War II, it's going to put Britain in its place. It's going to allow smaller countries like Ireland to experience independence. So he was absolutely pro-German. Now he was of mixed Irish and German descent. So he was very, very typical of a certain group in the United States. And he was a huge pop star, and he was a very significant figure in the Irish independence movement in the United States. And he, you know, that one of the moments that I tried to highlight in the book was the fact that in the British Parliament, when Britain ruled Ireland and Irish parliamentarians went to London, we had in Ireland a lobby who thought songwriters should have rights. And T.P. O'Neill sponsored a bill that established by law the rights of songwriters and the people and publishers, the people who own the songs. That's really big. But what's much bigger is that Victor Herbert does that in the United States. And it takes a couple of court battles. It takes a number of years. But Victor Herbert is the individual who spearheaded that drive to protect songwriters' work and to protect publishers' work. And the supreme irony is that the law case that decided that people should be paid when their music is played in restaurants and places, that case was against an Irish restaurant in New York. So there were Irish on both sides. And Victor Herbert, he always said, I'm a son of Ireland. But he never set foot in Ireland. He claimed that he was born in Dublin, but he'd never been there. But it was that presentation of Irishness and the advantages that brought within the Irish community, which was large, but also the fact that he could have identified as English and maybe he would have had an even bigger career. But he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted another fascinating character in this regard, Aileen O'Byrne and the Shanleys family as well. Both, I was reminded of when you were talking about them, the Shanleys, of an era where women were not allowed to go to restaurants on their own, and the Shanleys were obviously a very progressive family. In promoting live music and how they treated women in their establishments. Maybe you'd like to say.
Yeah, and again, that was a surprise to me, finding out more about the Shanleys and about the scale of their enterprise. These were people who left rural Ireland, post-famine rural Ireland, with literally nothing. And they established themselves. They did, what's known as chain emigration. One brother goes, he makes enough money to live in New York, sends the money home to bring the next brother, and eventually most of the family end up in New York in the restaurant industry. Yeah. And, these weren't small diners or cafes. These were prestigious dining establishments. The length of, if you've been in New York, the length of a block is a huge piece of real estate. That was the size of the Shanley's restaurant. And beneath that, the length of a block was their wine cellar. So they were phenomenally successful. They mixed with the highest and the lowest. And at that stage, the lowest were the Irish, who were just off the boat. And in particular, Irish women who did jobs that even other immigrants wouldn't touch. So would have been very uncommon for an Italian woman to be a nanny, because the idea of looking after someone else's children in their home was, we might be poor, but we're not going to do that. Whereas the Irish did. And again, when you see that Irish women, and you mentioned Ellen O'Byrne, to me, who's the great hero of this story. Ellen O'Byrne is absolutely the great role model. And to me, she's the founder of the Irish record industry, yet she doesn't really appear in the history. And, if I've done one thing with this book, with Jim, it's reinserting key people. And I think there's no one more key than Ellen O'Byrne.